The prisoner sat on a wooden bench, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, still smelling of smoke and iron from the last German rail yard he had seen. Across the barbed wire fence, American soldiers moved in silence, unloading crates from the back of a truck. At first he thought it was a ruse, some performance for the prisoner's eyes. The boxes were marked with strange logos, names he had never heard. Then he saw what spilled out. Loaves of white bread so soft they bent under their own weight, stacks of wool blankets and tins of meat glistening with fat. One mother, her dress patched in 3 places, reached trembling hands toward a soldier who towered over her. Instead of pushing her away, he bent down, placed a blanket around her child's shoulders, and pressed something small and golden into the boy's hand. Candy. Real candy. The boy stared as if he held a miracle. From behind the wire, the prisoner whispered to his comrade, almost ashamed, "They must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance in war." He had grown up on speeches about American decadence, about a land of chaos and hunger, a country too weak to last. But now, in the dying light of a ruined Europe, the evidence lay at his feet. The children of the enemy would sleep warmer tonight than German soldiers at the front. The man tightened his fists and looked away, but the sound followed him. The muffled sobs of German mothers, not for the defeat of their Reich, but for the blankets and bread their children had been given by men they were told to hate, and in that moment, something cracked inside him. What he didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Weeks later, after the shock of bread and blankets had begun to dull, another story swept through the POW barracks. It came first as rumor, passed like contraband between bunks. "The Americans have built a ship in 4 days," someone whispered. The others laughed bitterly. Impossible. Even in the most efficient German yards, a vessel took months, sometimes years. But then came the photographs, smuggled from a newspaper left on a guard's desk. A Liberty ship sliding into the water, crowds cheering, workers still in their overalls with grease on their hands. 4 days, not 4 months, 4 days. One prisoner, once an engineer at Kiel, studied the grainy picture under the dim light of the barracks. His lips tightened. He had overseen launches before, watched steel plates hammered into place with 1,000 rivets. He knew the math. The limits of manpower. It couldn't be true. And yet there it was, the evidence staring back at him. He folded the paper slowly, as though the act of closing it might erase the nightmare it suggested. At night, the men argued. Some insisted it was propaganda. Others, remembering the bread and the candy, fell silent. Deep inside, each man wondered the same thing. If a nation could build a ship in 4 days, how many could they launch in a month, a year? And if they could feed their children ice cream in wartime, what else were they capable of? One guard overheard and chuckled. "That ship you saw? By the time you finish talking, they've already laid the keel for the next." The words landed heavier than any rifle butt. The prisoners stared at the floor, their confidence hollowed out. They had been told America was a nation of weaklings, living in chaos. But the tide of truth was rising fast. What they didn't yet realize was that the lights of America would blind them even more than its factories. The first time they saw it, they thought the train must be passing through a dream. The German prisoners pressed their foreheads to the cold glass, staring out at American towns rolling past in the dark. But unlike Europe, where blackout curtains smothered every window, here the night shimmered. Whole neighborhoods glowed like lanterns scattered across the earth. Street lamps burned on every corner, neon signs buzzed above diners still open at midnight, and houses radiated with warm, steady light. One prisoner, a former Luftwaffe pilot, muttered under his breath, "They don't even turn them off. They waste light while we ration matches." Another shook his head in disbelief. Back in Germany, families stumbled in the dark, hiding from bombers, sewing by candlelight. And here, in the middle of a war, children sat reading comics beneath electric lamps, unconcerned, unafraid. The sight gnawed at them. Light, once a weapon of fear in Europe, was casual in America, limitless, abundant, almost arrogant. For men raised on speeches about the starving, crumbling United States, the glow of those cities was more terrifying than any battlefield report. It was proof of something deeper, a nation so rich in resources that it did not fear the night. One guard, noticing their silent awe, leaned in with a grin. "You think this is bright? Wait until we get to Chicago." The prisoners glanced at each other, suddenly unsure if he was joking. Some closed their eyes, unable to watch. Others stared harder, unwilling to blink, as if the glow itself might burn away everything they thought they knew. They believed the factories were frightening. They thought the ships were impossible. But it was the light, ordinary American light, that began to unravel them from the inside. The first trays arrived in the mess hall with a smell the prisoners didn't recognize. A soft bun split in half, meat sizzling between, steam rising. Beside it, a glass bottle filled with a dark, sweet liquid that hissed when opened. A guard set them down with no ceremony. Hamburgers, Coca-Cola. At first, the German soldiers refused. Some crossed their arms, sneering, convinced it was a trick. They had been told America was crumbling, its people starving, its children barefoot in the streets. Bread this white, meat this thick, a drink bubbling like champagne. It had to be staged, meant to humiliate them. But hunger works faster than pride. One man took a bite. The grease ran down his chin and he chewed in silence. Another raised the bottle to his lips, wincing at the sharp fizz, then swallowing with wide eyes. Soon the hall filled with the sound of men eating, the clink of glass on metal trays. They didn't laugh. They didn't speak. They ate slowly, almost reverently, as though every bite was proof that something inside them had been broken. For years they had marched on cabbage soup and dry bread, their bodies worn thin by rationing. Now, as prisoners, they were tasting what they had been told was impossible. One POW wrote in his diary that night, "The shame is worse than defeat. We are fed better as captives than our people at home as free men." And yet this was only another layer. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola weren't the end of the humiliation. They were just the beginning of an unraveling, one meal at a time. It sounded like a joke when the rumor spread across the decks. "The Americans make ice cream on their warships." The prisoners laughed at first. Warships were for steel and guns, for discipline and hunger, not for desserts. But then they saw it with their own eyes. In the middle of the Pacific, sailors wheeled out tubs of vanilla and chocolate, scooped into cones as casually as if they were back on Main Street. A German naval officer leaned against the railing, frozen, watching boys barely older than his son lick melting ice cream in the sun. Around them, aircraft engines roared, anti-aircraft guns stood ready, and still, ice cream. Sweet, cold, frivolous. It was the kind of luxury Germany hadn't known even in peacetime, let alone in the 5th year of a total war. The prisoners whispered among themselves. Was this arrogance, mockery? Or was it simply proof that America fought from a place of such wealth that war itself could not strip away its comforts? One man muttered bitterly, "They fight a world war, and they still have milk for ice cream. Our children drink watered soup." The image lodged deep in their minds. Not the machines, not the guns, but sailors smiling with dripping cones, sunlight flashing on steel. It was abundance made visible, mockery made edible. That night, as the sea rocked them to sleep, one prisoner confessed quietly, "If this is how they live at sea, I don't dare imagine how they live at home." And he was right. The next revelation would not come on the ocean, but on the rails, inside the velvet of a Pullman car. When the prisoners were told they would be moved inland, they braced for the worst. Boxcars, straw floors, the kind of cattle transport they themselves had once forced on others. Instead, when they were marched onto the platform, the sight waiting for them made some stop in their tracks. Gleaming Pullman cars stood ready, polished wood shining under the station lamps. Porters in pressed uniforms guided them forward as if they were paying guests. Inside, velvet seats swallowed their tired bodies. Curtains framed windows that opened onto endless American farmland. At night, beds folded down with clean sheets, pillows soft as home. A steward passed through with trays of hot coffee and rolls. The men sat in silence, stiff, unsure if they should eat. One whispered, "We are prisoners. Why are we being treated like customers?" The dissonance was unbearable. Back in Germany, civilians slept in bombed-out cellars. Even officers rarely traveled with such comfort. Here, captured soldiers were being carried across a continent as though they were businessmen on holiday. A young guard, barely 20, leaned over and said with a smile, "Don't get used to it. This is just how our trains run." The words landed like a hammer. One diary entry recorded the moment with bitterness. "Our Reich promised us superiority, yet I ride in more luxury as a captive than my family does in freedom. The hum of the rails, the gentle sway of the cars, the soft glow of lamps overhead, all of it chipped away at the lies they had been told. If even prisoners could travel in velvet, what must life be like for ordinary Americans? They thought this train ride was the height of humiliation, but medicine, something they had never expected, was about to break them even further. It began with a fever. One prisoner, thin from months of rations, collapsed in the yard. In Germany, he would have been left to sweat it out, or at best given aspirin if the officer saw fit. Here, in an American camp, guards rushed him to a small infirmary. White sheets, sterile instruments, the smell of antiseptic. The prisoners waiting outside could hardly believe what they saw next. A doctor in a crisp coat examined the man carefully, spoke gently through an interpreter, and then produced a vial. Penicillin. The miracle drug whispered about even in German hospitals, rationed only for high officers and the most valuable men. And now it was being injected into a common enemy soldier, a captive, a nobody. Within days, the fever broke. The man lived, and the rest of the camp whispered with unease. Why would they spend such medicine on us? Some argued it was propaganda, a trick to shame them. Others stared at their own hands, remembering comrades who had died for lack of treatment back home. One prisoner, once a medical student in Munich, watched in silence as another man was guided beneath an X-ray machine for a broken rib. The glowing plates revealed bones like shadows, technology he had only studied in theory. He wrote later, "I have seen German generals denied such care. Here, even prisoners are given it freely." The humiliation was quiet, but it cut deep. To be fed well was one thing. To be healed, treated with more dignity as a captive than as a soldier of the Reich, was another. And yet, what awaited them was stranger still. Medicine could heal a body, but the next discovery would shatter the mind, a pipeline carrying oil beneath the ocean itself. The rumor first sounded like madness. A pipe under the sea? Oil flowing beneath the waves, stretching from England to the beaches of France? In the barracks, prisoners laughed, shaking their heads. Impossible! Lies to scare us! But the whispers kept coming, repeated by guards with amused smiles, and then confirmed in Allied newspapers. Operation Pluto. Pipelines under the ocean. One captured engineer couldn't let it go. He had studied hydraulics in Berlin, had spent long nights drawing blueprints for bridges and pumps. He knew what salt water did to steel, what pressure did to joints. Yet here was proof. Miles of flexible pipeline, hidden under the English Channel, carrying millions of gallons of fuel directly to tanks and trucks at the front. The men argued late into the night. Some dismissed it. Others stared at the dirt floor, silently wondering how many other impossibilities had already been made real. One soldier muttered bitterly, "We bleed for a jerry can of gasoline. They run rivers of it under the sea." The shame was sharper than defeat. German propaganda had painted America as lazy, soft, incapable of great engineering. But Pluto was not laziness. It was vision, scale, audacity, things they had not even dared to imagine. A guard, overhearing their disbelief, chuckled. "You think this is impressive? Wait until you hear what Ford is building." The words hung in the stale air like a warning. What they did not know yet was that one American factory would crush the Reich's entire illusion of superiority by producing a bomber every single hour. The name Ford had always meant cars. Even German prisoners knew that. But in whispers that spread through the camps, Ford no longer stood for automobiles, it stood for bombers. Not one a week, not one a day, one every 63 minutes. At first they laughed. A factory that built airplanes the way it built Model Ts. Absurd. Aircraft were sacred machines, painstakingly assembled by hand. Wings aligned by engineers, rivets hammered with care, engines tuned by masters. To claim they rolled off an assembly line like sausages was an insult to engineering itself. But then came the testimonies. A Luftwaffe engineer captured in France had seen it with his own eyes. Willow Run, a mile-long plant outside Detroit. Endless rows of women in overalls, men with tools swinging in rhythm, machines stamping out parts as music played over loudspeakers. He swore that each hour the floor trembled as another bomber rolled off the line, engines coughing to life, taxiing straight toward the runway. The prisoners sat stunned. One wrote in his journal, "Our Reich boasts of craftsmanship. Their strength is multiplication. They fight with time itself." The scale was beyond imagination. Germany's factories strained under bombings, starving for materials, men forced into 12-hour shifts. And here, across the ocean, Americans punched clocks, ate steak for lunch, and still built more planes in a month than the Luftwaffe could dream of. One young guard, catching their whispers, leaned in casually. "By the time you've finished this meal, another bomber's already in the sky." The words sank like lead. Factories, pipelines, ships, lights. It all blurred into one overwhelming truth. America was not just winning the war. It was reshaping what war itself meant. But the next shock would cut deeper. Factories could be explained. Technology could be feared. What broke them was the sight of American workers eating like kings, while their own families starved at home. They had seen the factories, the ships, the cities of light, but nothing hollowed them out like the farms and workshops of ordinary America. Assigned to labor details in the Midwest, the prisoners worked alongside local men, mechanics, machinists, farmhands. They expected to see haggard workers, thin from rationing, desperate for pay. Instead, they saw leather jackets, polished boots, and cigarettes smoked without worry. At noon, the workers unpacked lunches, thick steaks grilled the night before, sandwiches stacked with ham and cheese, apples so fresh their skins cracked under a thumb. The prisoners sat apart, chewing government-issued rations, their eyes drifting toward the men who treated lunch like a feast. One POW whispered, half in awe, half in despair, "Their workers eat like our generals." The image would not leave them. A Reich built on the idea of German superiority had crumbled in a single lunch break. These were not officers, not industrial barons, not party leaders. These were ordinary men, as casual as the guards who whistled jazz tunes while fixing tractors, and yet their abundance made the very concept of the Reich feel fragile, almost pitiful. One prisoner recorded in his diary, "If this is how they feed the worker, then what riches must the leaders have? And if the worker is so well fed, how can they ever be broken?" The steak, the boots, the laughter in the lunchroom, these were weapons sharper than any blade. They proved a strength the Reich had never admitted, that America's power was not only in its machines, but in the everyday lives of its people. And soon, the prisoners would learn the most devastating truth of all. It wasn't only that America had more, it was that it could afford to throw it away. It was the smell they noticed first. A sharp tang of gasoline that clung to the wind, seeping into their clothes. When the trucks crested the hill, the prisoners saw them, vast tank farms stretching to the horizon, rows upon rows of silver cylinders, each taller than a house, each holding 50,000 gallons of fuel, oceans of fire, captured in steel. One man muttered, barely audible, This is enough to run an army." He was wrong. It was enough to run several. In Germany, fuel was rationed drop by drop. Tanks abandoned on roadsides for lack of it. Civilians stripping engines from cars, converting wood into gas. Pilots trained in gliders because aviation fuel was too precious. And here, across the barbed wire, the Americans built oceans of it, standing still, waiting for war to call. The true wound came later. Retreating Allied units, unwilling to risk capture, opened valves and torched millions of gallons of gasoline, waste on a scale so immense it felt obscene. Prisoners watched black smoke rise into the sky, their jaws clenched. One hissed through his teeth, "We die for a jerry can, and they burn rivers of it." The humiliation was unbearable because it wasn't waste, it was power. America could destroy what Germany could not even produce. It was abundance as strategy, fire as a weapon. That night, a prisoner wrote in a hidden notebook, "I no longer fear their guns. I fear their excess, for it shows they cannot be broken. But if oceans of fuel broke their spirit, what came next would feel like sorcery. Shells that could think, exploding in the air, guided by radar. Weapons that made the sky itself turn against them." The first time the prisoners heard of it, they dismissed it as fantasy. A shell that could think? A weapon that knew when to explode? Impossible. Artillery in their world was crude. Fire. Weight. Hope. Yet reports began filtering in from the front. Squadrons of aircraft torn from the sky by invisible hands, shells detonating mid-air with perfect timing. One German anti-air officer, captured during the Ardennes, tried to explain the fear. He described watching a formation of fighters dive, expecting to break through. But before they reached their target, the sky lit with sudden bursts. Not random, not lucky. Each shell seemed to anticipate, blooming exactly where the planes flew. "It was as if the shells could see us," he said, his voice low, eyes distant. The secret was the proximity fuse, a radar brain packed inside a shell's nose. No longer did artillery gamble on range. The shell listened, judged, and detonated when it sensed an aircraft's shadow. For German pilots, it was like flying into a storm of intelligence. Every cloud wired with intent to kill. In the POW camp, word of this spread like poison. Soldiers sat rigid, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One muttered bitterly, "They have given thought to bullets. What hope is left against such a people?" Even more crushing than the technology was the casual way Americans spoke of it. Guards mentioned the fuse with offhand pride, the same tone they used to talk about baseball scores. For the prisoners, it was unbearable. A weapon so advanced that their enemy treated it like routine. They thought they had seen the future in factories and pipelines. But this was something darker. The future had turned into a weapon, and it was aimed directly at them. What they didn't yet realize was that the nightmare would only deepen. Bastogne was waiting, a place where German faith in victory would finally collapse under the weight of American abundance and steel. The Ardennes was supposed to be their last great gamble. The Führer promised it would break the Allies, drive them back to the sea. German columns pushed through snow and forest, iron treads grinding frozen earth. But at Bastogne, the promise shattered. The prisoners who had fought there spoke of it with haunted eyes. The town was ringed by American paratroopers, cut off, frozen, outnumbered. Logic said they should have collapsed. Instead, they held. Supplies dropped from the sky by parachute. Artillery never seemed to run dry. And worst of all, new weapons screamed through the winter air, shells that burst overhead, machine guns fed by endless belts, tanks that rolled forward as if fueled by the very snow itself. One sergeant described the moment his unit tried to storm a ridge. He had expected silence after their barrage. Instead, radar-guided fire rained down with precision he could not understand. Men fell before they even reached the wire. He remembered crawling into the snow, staring at the sky, whispering, "They fight with a future we do not have." The humiliation deepened when word spread of General McAuliffe's reply to their demand for surrender. One word: nuts. It was absurd, infuriating, but also terrifying. An American general laughed at their ultimatum. Laughed in the middle of encirclement. For the prisoners who had believed in German superiority, Bastogne was not just a battlefield defeat. It was a revelation. The Reich's promises of invincibility meant nothing against a nation that could fight starvation with chocolate bars, fight winter with parachuted blankets, fight entire offensives with factories oceans away. When the survivors were finally captured, they marched into prison camps with a silence heavier than chains. Bastogne had not only broken their lines, it had broken their faith. And still, there was more to come. For soon they would learn that even the skies, once ruled by the Luftwaffe, were no longer theirs. Radar itself would turn the heavens into an American hunting ground. For years, the Germans had told themselves that Allied bombing was luck, that every raid that found its mark was chance, or treachery, or sheer numbers. But then, the truth leaked out. The Americans weren't navigating blind at all. They had radar in the sky. Captured pilots spoke of it with hollow voices. They had watched B-17s and Liberators cut through storms, punching through clouds that should have scattered them. They landed on runways at night as if guided by invisible hands, and the worst part, no one could see it. No lights, no signals, just ghostly waves sweeping across the heavens, finding targets, guiding bombs, bringing pilots home. One Luftwaffe officer admitted under interrogation, "It is not chance, it is precision. We are fighting an enemy who no longer fears the dark." His words fell like a death sentence in the barracks. For the prisoners, the realization was unbearable. In Germany, blackout curtains strangled every town. Factories worked by candle and secrecy, yet across the ocean, the Americans turned night into an ally. They wielded lightning as casually as a tool. A young guard, overhearing their hushed talk, grinned. "You think it's just navigation? Radar tells us where you are before you even take off." The silence that followed was heavier than any blow. To a people who had built their pride on engineering and discipline, the idea that the enemy could bend the very airwaves into weapons felt like sorcery. The Reich's skies were no longer German skies. They had become a hunting ground. And from that moment, the prisoners began to look not at the machines, but at themselves. If America could conquer darkness, abundance, and even the invisible, what was left of the superiority they had been promised? The answer would come not from another invention, but from within, the slow, humiliating collapse of their own belief. By now, the prisoners no longer argued about machines. They had seen too much. Ships in 4 days, fuel beneath the sea, bombs that thought, radar that saw through storms. The shock of technology had burned itself out. What remained was something quieter, far more dangerous, the collapse of doctrine. In the dim light of the barracks, men once loyal to the Reich sat in silence. Some stared at their boots, others at the ceiling, as if words might betray them. A young soldier finally whispered, "If they can build like this, feed like this, heal like this, then who is truly superior?" No one answered. The silence was the answer. The indoctrination that had fueled them since boyhood, that Germany was destiny, that Americans were mongrels, soft, decadent, crumbled under every meal, every blanket, every casual miracle of abundance. They began to envy the very people they were taught to despise. One diary entry confessed, "I feel pride in their workers, shame in my own." And yet this was the cruelest wound. It wasn't defeat on the battlefield. It was defeat of the spirit. The Reich had promised them glory, sacrifice, immortality. But America offered hamburgers to prisoners, medicine to enemies, light to children. Against that, ideology felt brittle, absurd, even grotesque. Some tried to cling to hatred, speaking bitterly of propaganda, of tricks, of exaggerations. But each new revelation made their voices weaker. Others, too ashamed to speak, simply fell silent, staring at their hands as if they no longer recognized them. What the Reich could not anticipate was that its greatest weapon, belief, would not be crushed by bombs, but by blankets, and once belief shattered, there was no repairing it. The cracks widened with each passing day, and soon silence itself became more damning than words. The guards never asked for it, but the prisoners began to watch them with a strange, uneasy respect. It happened in small ways, almost invisible. A soldier lighting a cigarette, offering one to his comrade with a casual grin. A sergeant leaning against a fence post, humming a jazz tune while the sun set. Ordinary moments, unremarkable to Americans, but to men raised on tales of enemy barbarism, they felt like revelations. One prisoner, once a proud Nazi youth leader, admitted in his journal, "They are not weak. They are not crude. They live simply, but there is strength in their ease. They do not fear us. They do not fear anything." Requests began trickling into the camp library. English dictionaries, American newspapers, novels with words they had to stumble through slowly. Men who once spat at the thought of America now sat in corners, tracing lines of text, mouthing syllables like forbidden prayers. Hatred had not vanished, but curiosity had replaced it, and curiosity was even more dangerous to doctrine. The admiration was silent because to say it aloud was treason against everything they had been taught. But it leaked in their gestures, the way they lingered over a Coca-Cola bottle before returning it, or the way they mimicked the easy slang of the guards when they thought no one was listening. The Reich had promised them glory and given them rubble. America had given them nothing but blankets, food, and medicine, and it was enough to make them wonder if they had been fighting for the wrong side all along. The silence in the barracks grew heavier each night, not the silence of defiance, but of men who no longer knew what to believe, and soon that silence would break, not into admiration, but into shame. It began with something small, an orange. A boy on the other side of the fence peeled it slowly, juice dripping down his chin. The prisoners stared, unable to look away. In Germany, children had not seen such fruit in years. Even officers' families scraped by on turnips and black bread. Yet here, in wartime America, a child wasted sweetness on sticky fingers. One German officer could not stand it. He turned his back, shoulders rigid, but later that night he wrote in his diary, "It is shameful to admit, but I envy their children more than I pity them. They play with chocolate, they waste fruit, while ours dig through rubble for scraps." His words carried no hatred, only a bitter admiration that cut deeper than defeat. The humiliation was not the abundance itself, but the realization of what it revealed. America had so much that even its smallest citizens lived with a kind of casual luxury unimaginable in the Reich. A child's candy bar, an orange at lunch, a glass of milk at bedtime. These were greater symbols of power than tanks or planes. Around the barracks, conversations grew hesitant. Some whispered that perhaps the war had been doomed from the start. Others fell into silence, staring into their tin cups as if answers might rise from the dregs of coffee. For men raised on slogans of German superiority, to feel envy toward the enemy's children was an unspoken confession of collapse. One prisoner finally murmured aloud, voice trembling with both awe and despair, "They do not even know how rich they are. And we, our people, we were told we were the masters of the world." The others said nothing, but in their silence, belief drained away. And the next stage would be darker still. For once, shame settled in, the very faith that bound them to the Reich began to unravel thread by thread. By the winter of 1945, the silence in the barracks had changed. It was no longer the silence of discipline, of men trained not to speak. It was the silence of belief collapsing. Arguments once filled the nights, heated defenses of the Reich, proud boasts of German ingenuity. But now, when someone muttered a party slogan, the words fell dead in the air. No one answered. No one even looked up. The slogans had become hollow echoes. One evening, a young prisoner broke that silence. He whispered, barely audible, "I don't believe in it anymore." Every head turned. Some eyes flashed anger, but most stared down at their hands, as if ashamed to admit they felt the same. The old certainties, that Germany was destined to lead, that Americans were weak, no longer stood against the evidence of factories, food, and freedoms they had seen. Letters were drafted but never sent, confessions folded into pockets. "I was told the enemy was starving. Instead, I have eaten their bread. I was told their nation was weak. Instead, I have seen its strength. What is left to believe?" The ink shook on the page as men wrote the thoughts they dared not speak aloud. The collapse was not dramatic, not sudden. It was slow erosion, like a fortress wall crumbling stone by stone. First came envy, then shame, and finally the unbearable weight of doubt. For men raised to see themselves as masters of destiny, the greatest humiliation was not losing battles. It was realizing they had been lied to from the beginning. One guard later recalled how the prisoners looked at him when he handed out books in English. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with a strange, defeated hunger for words, for knowledge, for something solid to replace the ruins inside them. Faith in the Reich had carried them to war. But now, that faith lay in pieces, and with it, the last illusion of superiority. In the dim light of the barracks, men began to write. Not orders, not reports, but letters, pages filled with words that would never cross the ocean. They wrote by candle stubs, hunched over scraps of paper, whispering their thoughts through ink because their voices could no longer carry them. One prisoner addressed his wife. "I was told America was starving, that its people were weak. But I have eaten their bread, drunk their milk, seen their lights burning through the night. It is we who starve, not they. Forgive me for believing the lies." He folded the page carefully, tucked it into his coat, and never mailed it. Another wrote to his son, a boy too young to understand war. "You will grow in ruins. I wish you could see what I have seen here. I wish you could know that the world is bigger than the Reich told us." When the guards collected the mail, he slipped the letter under his mattress instead. Dozens of such drafts lived and died inside the camp. Some were burned in stoves, ashes scattered before dawn. Others were hidden in boots, pockets, the linings of jackets. They were confessions, betrayals, or perhaps acts of survival. To admit aloud that faith was broken was dangerous, but to write it down was to acknowledge the truth, if only to oneself. A guard once stumbled upon a crumpled page left behind. He never told the prisoners what it said, but later he remarked to another American, "They've already surrendered, not to us, to themselves." The letters never sent were heavier than chains. They carried words that could not be spoken in daylight, words that marked the death of belief. And as the trains rumbled to carry them home, those words rattled inside their chests like secrets too loud to silence. But the war was not over for them. For on the long journey back through the glowing fields of America, the collapse of faith would turn into something even darker, a quiet, simmering rage. The train rattled across the American heartland, its steel wheels carving a rhythm that seemed to echo the prisoners' thoughts. They sat by the windows, eyes fixed on a landscape that refused to fit the picture painted in their youth. Farms stretched for miles, barns painted red, silos rising like monuments of plenty. Gas stations gleamed at crossroads, cars lined neatly as if fuel were endless. Children played in schoolyards, chasing balls across green fields, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. It was not the America of Nazi speeches, broken, starving, chaotic. It was a country alive, overflowing, indifferent to war in a way that felt more terrifying than any weapon. One prisoner pressed his forehead to the glass, watching a farmer toss hay to cattle so fat they barely moved. He muttered bitterly, "Our people eat turnips. Their cows eat better than we do." No one corrected him. The silence was agreement. Every mile was another wound. They had fought for a Reich that promised destiny, superiority, eternity. And yet here, as captives, they were carried past a vision of life their nation could never match. It was not just defeat they saw, it was irrelevance. When the train slowed for a stop, an old woman waved from the platform, her arms full of bread. She wasn't waving at the guards, nor at the officers aboard. She waved at the children of her own town, who ran laughing to greet her. Bread in the arms of civilians, blankets draped over their shoulders. For the prisoners, the image burned worse than any battlefield memory. That night, as the train rolled on, one man whispered what none had dared to say aloud. Perhaps we were never superior. Perhaps we were only blind. The others did not answer. They simply sat in the dark, listening to the wheels carry them away from the myth they once believed, toward a future they could no longer imagine. The war had ended, but for many of them, peace never arrived. The memory of guns and battles blurred with time, but what stayed sharp was stranger, quieter. The bread, the blankets, the lights that never went out. One prisoner, long released, returned home to find his village in ruins. Children scavenged for wood, women lined up for watery soup. He carried no stories of glorious battles. Instead, he carried an image he could never erase. American soldiers kneeling in the mud, wrapping blankets around German children who weren't their own. He had seen mothers weep not at defeat, but at kindness. That was the wound that refused to heal. In a diary discovered years later, a former officer had written, "We came as soldiers. We left as witnesses. America's weapons were steel and fire, yes, but its true victory was abundance. It fought us not only with bombs, but with light, with food, with mercy, and in that, it shattered us more deeply than any army could." The Reich had demanded belief. America had demanded nothing, and yet won everything. That quiet strength haunted them long after the barbed wire was gone. Even now, if you stand in certain German villages, old men will tell you of the first Coca-Cola they tasted, the first orange their children held, the first time they realized the world was not what they had been told. Their voices falter, because the memory carries both shame and gratitude. The story ends not on a battlefield, but on a railway platform where children clutch warm blankets against the cold. Their mothers, eyes hollow from years of hunger, cry into their hands as enemy soldiers place bread into small palms. No speeches, no banners, just the unbearable truth that kindness can break a man more than bullets ever will. And so the question remains, echoing across generations. If your grandfather had seen those tears, had heard those mothers weep, what would he have said?